Hallo und willkommen zu unserem Podcast Der Rest ist Geschichte. Well, that burst of fluent German may well be leading you to worry that you've downloaded the wrong podcast.
Shameless. Absolutely shameless.
Yes, I know. Hello and welcome to Beginner's German is our new theme.
When Sacha Baron Cohen played a character called Bruno, a
yes,
kind of Austrian.
Of course. Yes. Fashion designer, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah, well, thanks, Dominic. Of course, with me is, I'm Tom Holland. With me is Dominic Sandbrook. And why the burst of Deutsch? We may be wondering. Well, because today our subject is Prussia, Germany, and the birth of the nation, which would become the most powerful European state of the 20th century. And Dominic, before we get into this, I think we should try and establish the parameters, because obviously the beginnings of Prussia, we've got to go back to Teutonic Knights, haven't we? We've got, the pagan Prussians on the shores of the Baltic. So that's where I think we should begin.
Well, Tom, my policy is you should, of course, talk about those things, but I think you should talk about them probably on your own after the podcast is finished. And in order to bolster my case that basically we should talk about what I think is the most interesting period in German history, which is when Germany is just created. So between, let's say, 1870 and the Second World War, we have got an excellent guest who has written a book on just this period called Blood and Iron, Katja Hoyer. We have Katja Hoyer. How exciting that is. So Katja was born in Germany. She studied at the Friedrich Schiller University, and her book, Blood and Iron, is basically all about, the Kaiser's Germany. So welcome, Katja. You're now based in Britain. Is that right?
I am, yes. So I'm in Sussex. I've lived here for about 10 years now, and I've got dual citizenship as well. So I feel very much part of both countries really now, and feel very much at home here too.
Well, Katja, Dominic's going to love you, because we actually did a podcast earlier on the causes of the First World War, and Dominic was rooting massively for an Anglo-German alliance against the French.
I'm currently reaching for that, so always.
I'm sure that's something we'll come on to. And Katja, do you agree with Dominic that we shouldn't be looking at the pagan Prussians or even Frederick the Great or Napoleon? We should be going straight into, I guess, really the Franco-Prussian War is where we begin, is it?
Well, always lead back to the 19th century as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Well, could I begin just by, we've got a question here from Ben Dussault, who asks, what the hell is Prussia? So I think that's as good a place to start as any. I've never been able to find a concise, easy to understand explanation that my America-centric mind can comprehend. So I guess Ben is American, but we in England as well are often very ignorant about Prussian history. So can you just, what the hell is Prussia? A starter for 10.
Well, I think in many ways, even that isn't clear because of its geography, really. When you look at how distributed the territory was throughout its history, that's part of its problem. What the hell is Prussia was probably asked by, people that were trying to reign over it themselves. When you look at this dualism between, Brandenburg and Prussia, which then kind of merge via various alliances and marriages and dynasticism and other issues, even those two territories, the fact that they're miles apart from each other with huge gaps in the middle, and later only merge into kind of one big block there near in the north of Germany is in itself a problem. And then, of course, you've got so many different ethnicities there in the Baltic region, trying to later on live all under one political entity, really. I think that in itself explains why there's such problems in understanding, I think, Prussia. And then, of course, the fact that it vanished in the 20th century and is now an entity that doesn't exist anymore makes it more difficult as well. So in a nutshell, it's an area in the Baltic region in what is now the north of Poland, where it sort of originated. And the area in Brandenburg that it merged with is in what is now northern Germany. So geographically, that's where we're sort of located. The name comes from the sort of original Prussian people that...
Yes.
Do you want to go there? Do you want to go there?
Brilliant.
Or the sort of Prussian people, as they're called in German, who were then sort of in quite a horrific and bloody conquest, sort of conquered by the Teutonic Knights as they came back from Crusade, and the Polish king asked them for help to deal with these people in his northern realm that he was sort of struggling with, and that's sort of where the name stuck. Although, of course, the Germanic people that then settled there weren't the same as the original Prussians, if you will, but the geographical name stuck. Yeah, and then via various different, as I was saying earlier, marriage alliances, inheritances, conquests, and so on, that territory slowly merged closer and closer together there in the north. And the first sort of Prussian, well, I suppose once it becomes a kingdom in 1701, you can really see it sort of all merge together. But even then, you could argue, if Frederick the Great was still concerned about the kind of how spread out people were in the entire region and that there wasn't really any sense of cohesion. So even he led like a German settlement program there where he was trying to incentivize people to move there and so on, to try and have a kind of densely populated, German populated area there to reign over. So that question is very justified in many ways because it isn't one homogeneous, nice block where people all speak the same language, look and talk the same, are the same, but it's quite a messy block of different kind of entities before it all gets merged together.
And Katja, that raises a slightly different question. I mean, obviously, if we were doing this podcast in 1850, our listeners would have kind of had a sense of what Prussia was and Prussian history and all the rest of it. But obviously, Prussia then was subsumed was the key actor in creating something called Germany, which we're now very familiar with. One of the things that your book starts with basically the creation of Germany in 1870-71. And one of the questions that kind of nags at me and is there kind of underlying your whole book is it to the extent to which Germany was basically an artificial creation. So that there was an England, there was clearly a France, but how much do you think Germany was real and how much was it imagined and invented by Bismarck and the first Kaiser?
Well, I think the question is sort of split into fragments. If you ask a liberal or democratic minded person in the 19th century whether Germany is real, to them it was. I would say certainly since the liberation wars against Napoleon, this idea that the German lands were kind of one entity and then you've got it contrasted against, say, the French people or the English people. That idea was there, certainly amongst the sort of liberal elements in the German-speaking lands. And there's always this phrase, as far as the German tongue is heard, there should be a Germany. So there was a sense, I think, via linguistic similarities that people felt, they were the same people and ought to be in the same state. And then contrasted to that, you've got all of the people who have an interest in keeping, the separate German states. So people like Bismarck himself, actually, who were very much kind of minded that they were Prussians, Bavarians, Rhinelanders, Hamburgers, whatever. I always laugh at the Hamburger thing, but never mind. So there's all of these different people who had a vested interest in keeping their own political power and their kingdoms and their duchies intact, and certainly didn't feel a sense of kind of Germanness, as it were. So throughout the 19th century, I would say it becomes more real as there are more conflicts of the German-speaking lands where they're kind of in one pot against somebody else. And I think that's what defines, in the end, Germany, is that it contrasts itself against other peoples.
Because, Katja, presumably the reason why there isn't a kind of a sense of a German state in the way that you have England or France is because all these various German states, principalities, bishoprics, whatever, for centuries and centuries are part of the Holy Roman Empire. And that then gets abolished by Napoleon. And even though Napoleon is defeated, it doesn't get reanimated. And so is there a sense between the ending of the Holy Roman Empire and the emergence of what becomes the German Empire that in a sense people are looking around for a way to kind of reestablish a sense of unity? Or are most of the states happy to kind of basically be independent?
I think it's because the German Empire that emerges, the Second Reich, if you will, and it's called the Second Reich because it's trying to create some sort of, I suppose, a sense of continuity between the Holy Roman Empire and that. But it's much more unified in, that it actually becomes a nation state with a centralized government. So when you look at the Holy Roman Emperor and the way that he had to almost haggle every time he wants to go to war, will people actually join him? Will they actually be with him? Because there wasn't a sense that people, say, in Prussia were necessarily directly in the same, construct or unit as people, say, in Bavaria were, and their interests quite often diverged completely. Whilst I think from 1871, there is more of a sense of, they are now in one state and need to pull together. And I think that's of course, as I was trying to say in my book as well, that's of course perpetuated with this kind of constant conflict that people are trying to to create almost artificially to try and keep the Germans together. But I don't think the Holy Roman Empire had that to the same extent. I think that was more of a loose kind of conglomerate, whilst 1871 actually creates a nation sense in the actual sense of the word.
In your book, though, that moment is so you basically describe how the Second Reich is created through war, don't you? You have 3 wars. They fight the Danes, the Austrians, who are German speaking, but are basically shut out of the new German creation, and then the French. And you sort of, I mean, the title Blood and Iron is it's from Bismarck, but it's obviously, imbued with this sort of sense that it's all a very militaristic project and the army is crucial and a sense of fighting other people and all the rest of it. Do you think that makes, I don't know how, I don't think you do kind of sign up to the Sonderweg idea, which is that basically Germany had this weird special path that explains what happened to it in the 20th century. But do you think Germany's beginnings were more bloody, more militaristic, and that the essence of the nation was, to do with fighting in a way that it wasn't of other European nations?
I certainly don't subscribe to the whole Sonderweg theory in the sense that, I find it slightly too deterministic for my own liking, like this idea that it was failed from the start. I think that's something I try to contrast in the book, or kind of, question in the book. But I do think the inherent problem in this 1871 creation is indeed that it's based at that moment, it's based on blood and iron. I think, as Bismarck was saying it was, I think he was completely, he's a very observant man, and I think realized that was the problem with it. He himself, actually, even still as late as 1868, he still said he doesn't think the creation of a German state is possible within this century. He was still saying 3 years before he did it, it's going to take another 3 decades to do it. And that tells you everything you need to know. I think in that moment, it's a forced way of doing it, because you wouldn't have been able to get, say, the southern states in particular, Bavaria and Baden, on board, because they were politically, religiously, in every way you want to look at it, completely different from this northern German bloc that Bismarck had created. And whilst I know there's various people in Germany who will sit there and say we didn't want to be Prussian either, but I think, in this kind of northern bloc, I think it was easier to achieve for cultural reasons than, say, getting the very liberal people in Baden on side, or the very arch-Catholic people in Bavaria. So it took conquest at that point, I think.
Katja, just to turn that on its head, could you not also argue that in a way, Germany kind of wills itself into being, not because it's a land of soldiers, but because it's a land of philosophers, and the kind of the dream of nationalism, the kind of the idealism that you'd associate with Kant, probably after Frederick the Great, the most famous Prussian before Bismarck. And the Brothers Grimm, the idea that, the kind of identity that is deep in the forest and the soil and everything. I mean, that's also a very important part of how Germany kind of imagines itself into being, isn't it? Or have I got that wrong?
No, I completely agree. I think that's exactly that dualism, that I was trying to describe earlier between the sort of liberal elements and the elites. I think it's exactly the same with, if you contrast the soldiers and the philosophers with each other. So there are, of course, people like Hegel, Arndt, Kant, as you mentioned, kind of where there's a long German tradition really of thinking in a particular way, or political thought and philosophical thought in that sense. And people like Hegel, for instance, were actively pushing to have Germany unified as well, and were part of the unifying forces. But I think without then the middle classes joining in with that, because they wanted unification for economic reasons, really, and were then buying into all of those philosophical ideas, alongside their economic interests, really, you get a kind of growing sense of something needs to happen, something needs to or somebody needs to basically join Germany. But I think the fact that it happened, or the reason why it happened then when it happened in 1871, was down to blood and iron and Bismarck and the conquest. I think eventually it would have happened in any case, and probably in a different way. But as Bismarck says, probably 30, 40 years on, rather than at that particular point in time.
Regular listeners to this podcast will not be surprised. Tom asks about philosophers. I want to ask a question about, I don't know, plumbers. So at what point do...
You asked about soldiers, Dominic.
I did.
The militarist and the philosopher.
That's the way my mind works. So at what point does the sort of common man and woman, at what point do they start thinking of themselves as Germans? And the one reason I ask is because I've recently been reading a lot of stuff about the First World War, and it's really striking there how, when at the sort of Christmas truces or whatever, and they're fraternizing with the British, they'll sort of, people from Baden or something will say, oh, we're really nice and we're just like you, but the Prussians are complete monsters. And they sort of, it's clear there are big divisions, and they think of themselves, sometimes state first, country, well, maybe not country second, but their state identity is really important to them. At what point did those things cross over? So at what point did Germans think of themselves as Germans first and Württembergers or Bavarians or Prussians second, if at all?
Yeah, I would say it started once again with the Napoleonic Wars. So when you look at, when Frederick William III comes out and actually calls first on all Prussians and then on all Germans to join him, and this actually works. And then you've got really kind of unifying moments like, what is now called the Battle of the Nations, like the Battle of Leipzig, where there's a sense that this is like a national effort almost, even though, of course, the Austrians and other sort of nations, if you will, joined in with that as well. But there is a sense that if Germans fight together, they can do this. They can even drive somebody, like the mighty Napoleon out.
So, Katja, in a way, the paradox is that Napoleon, in a sense, is the godfather of a united Germany.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is one of the great, sort of really moments how was Napoleon ended up being a driver. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Well, it started already when you think that there were over 400 little states in the Holy Roman Empire, and Napoleon unified them into the 39 states that were then still left after the Congress of Vienna in 1815. So, in many ways, he is a great lever of unification, if you will. And the other thing is because this was largely or kind of certainly to large elements, a volunteer force. So you got the famous Lutzer volunteers who then gave Germany the colors, the black, red and gold colors on their uniforms, that kind of stuff. So the fact that this is like the people fighting, rather than the state telling them they have to, they volunteered. There's lots of, even at that point, women, children, civilians that join in by huge volunteer campaigns and donating metal and all that kind of stuff. So I think Germans began to feel at the beginning of the 19th century that, if they rally together, if they pull together against somebody distinctly foreign by their language, by their culture and so on, that there is a sense of unity. And you see that again in the 1840 French scare when the French King Louis Philippe thought, he's going to say he was going to sort his own internal problems out by doing a bit of saber rattling, and he was, disputing various territories along the River Rhine and so on. And all of a sudden you get demonstrations all over Germany. And that answers perhaps your question, Dominic, about ordinary people, that this wasn't instigated by the state. There's ordinary people in 1840 going out in Baden, in Bayern, in, everywhere, basically all over Germany, going out on the streets saying, this is our River Rhine. And, this kind of myth of the watch on the Rhine and all that, is beginning to emerge then as a kind of German concept. There are now Bavarians somehow worried about what's going on, at the River Rhine, which gives you some sort of idea that they feel a sense of connection to the people that live there, even though they're not, traditionally speaking, historically speaking, in the same territory. So I think it's those moments of conflict, again, going back to the same idea, that brings ordinary people out and kind of gets them on side with the middle classes and the liberals and those kind of social classes that have, from an intellectual point, argued for.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, Tom, I know I'm jumping in again. Can I ask a question, though, about a bit of Germany or a bit of German-speaking Europe that doesn't fit in, which is Austria? So obviously they fight against the Austrians in order to set up Germany, but Austria has this weird place because, if you'll forgive me for saying, the single best-known German of all time was Austrian, and the single greatest, the man who talked more loudly anyway and more stridently about German unity and Germanness was an Austrian. And that's always kind of puzzled me that sort of Hitler must have had an accent, and he must have seemed to some Germans surely like an outsider, or not? How does Austria fit into the kind of German imagination?
Well, just briefly on the Hitler thing. Again, it seems all discussions lead back to him. But he was acutely aware of that and actually trained himself to have a kind of quite over the top Bavarian accent. So that kind of really harsh accent that you hear in, those speeches and things that you see, mostly now on TV and in documentaries and stuff, that's a Bavarian accent, and he's deliberately gone out of his way to try and acquire that, and then make sure that he sounds German rather than Austrian German. So that's one thing maybe on that one. He was quite, himself quite consciously aware of that fact. And then Austria is a weird one because they've always got, with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they've always got one foot like in the east in that sense. And if, from a German unification point of view, and with this whole as far as the German tongue is heard, you could have maybe had the German-speaking part of Austria eventually join that in the way that Hitler did as well with the Anschluss. But the fact that they would have never given up the other side, the sort of Eastern European side with the multitude of different peoples and languages and cultures in that, I think would have made this kind of intellectual Germanness thing that underpinned German unification to some extent, I think difficult to, to sell and certainly in terms of real political terms, I think it would have been difficult unless you create a massive German empire in the center of Europe, which again, would have then encompassed a lot of millions of non-German, ethnically and linguistically non-German people. So I think that's part of what made it so difficult. And then, of course, the dualism between Austria and Prussia wouldn't have been solved within a German union.
Well, so much still to talk about. I think we should take a break here. But when we come back, we've got lots of questions and lots more Prussian history to explore. Hello, welcome back to The Rest is History. We're talking Prussia, emergence of Germany, all such things like that. Katja, we were talking about Austria and Germany. Could I just ask you a question about Prussia as a state that is kind of more recent than many of the the cities that line the Rhine that often go back to the kind of Roman times? Those cities must have a sense of their antiquity, perhaps of their cultural superiority, and a sense of Prussia as a kind of parvenu. Is that an issue for Germans in the 19th century? The sense that do they feel, perhaps rather as the French and the British do, that the Prussians are kind of upstarts?
I think so to some extent. I mean, Bismarck himself uses this metaphor. I think I talk about that in the book as well. If I haven't cut it out, no, I think it's in there. He calls he calls the Prussian ship a sort of modern frigate, and compares it to the old Austrian, ship that's much kind of slower, grander, bigger, but also about to sink. And so in many ways,
yeah.
There's this idea that Prussia is a trim, modern, industrialized entity, whilst the other powers are old and crumbling. And I think they deliberately make use of that kind of lack of ancient history in that sense, because it fits in, doesn't it, with industrialization, with the military and with all of those things.
And I'm right. I mean, basically, Britain is the first industrial nation, but over the 19th century, the British seem to spend all their time worrying that actually Germany is massively overtaking them, presumably because Germany is by far the most industrially sophisticated country in Europe.
It's the speed of the catch-up as well that worries everyone. So when you look at just how quickly they overtake Britain in things like steel production, obviously, which Britain hasn't naturally got all that much of, all of these kind of, and coal and things like that. So all of the elements really that you need for, industry and for military as well, and for the economy and so on. And it's that worries people. So by 1914, pretty much, you got the second largest navy, for instance, in the world out of nothing, within just a few decades. So people were looking at that wondering, give it another 10, 20 years and see where that's going. So, yes, I think that's very much a concern. It's basically, it goes back once again to the Napoleonic Wars when the Rhineland was given to Prussia in 1815. And I don't know why, but nobody seems to have thought much of it. The Austrians certainly completely underestimated that. They thought, oh, good, we got rid of that problem of having to look after the pesky Belgians, which, had been annoying the Habsburg for ages, and they always needed to send troops up there to keep them at bay. And they were kind of thinking, oh, let Prussia do that, that's fine, and give them the Rhineland. And all of a sudden, they get all the coal, iron ore and everything else there and end up being an industrial superpower.
We have a question on that very theme from Nicholas Walton, who asked, was Prussia's influence over Western Germany and the subsequent 20th century misadventures all Britain's fault for its post-Napoleonic settlement? Dominic's shaking his head at that.
Yeah, that's always Britain's fault, isn't it? Go on, Katja.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So it most definitely is. And I mean, Britain was you got to put that into context of Napoleon just having, literally gone over the entire continent and conquered it in no time. And there was certainly a sense that the balance of power in Europe needed to be restored. And then you look at Austria, and Austria hasn't actually changed. You know, like basically people sat there wondering, well, you couldn't keep Napoleon at bay in the state that you were in then. What's changed now? You know, what's going to happen if the French do it again? And so there was a sense that Prussia had now emerged as a valid, trustworthy, reliable ally on the continent. Bear in mind that they fought on the same side as well. You know, there was no reason whatsoever to suspect the Prussians of the later catastrophes that would eventually ensue, you know, like literally a century later. So to sit there and go, oh, this is all Britain's fault seems a bit odd. So the idea that there was another strong stabilizing force on the continent to counterbalance French power was appealing to all sides really in Europe.
There are lots of questions about this and about Prussia, and basically hanging over a lot of these questions is World War One. So, for example, somebody called Pharaoh Man says Prussian militarism is a well-worn cliche. So obviously it was a huge British newspaper cliche in the 1910s. As a society, he says, was Prussia really that militaristic? And was it militaristic in ways that were completely different from other countries? And just to sort of follow up on his question, I think France proportionately had more men under arms in 1914 than Germany did. You know, France was a more obviously militaristic country, I would argue, than Germany was, even though we don't really remember it that way. But anyway, Katja, you'll have your own answer. I think you may disagree with me, actually. You think it was very militaristic, don't you?
Fairly. I think the problem is that it's culturally a slightly different thing. And again, that stems from those Landwehr and volunteer units in the Napoleonic Wars. So at the moment you have a significant proportion of your country, you know, as effectively like a militia force, it seeps into society in a much more deep-seated way, I think. And that, I think, is part of Prussia's problem is that where it's located in the center of Europe and where it's completely vulnerable, you know, throughout its history to the surrounding powers, there has always been a huge sense of the people need to defend this, or else, you know, they had the experience of things like obviously the Napoleonic Wars, but also before that. You get the 30 Years' War, for example, completely ravaging the country. And so I think the sense of people need to be soldiers is much, much more deep-seated psychologically, I think, in Prussia than it is in other countries necessarily. Where in France, of course, you got a long-standing and fine military tradition, but it's very much it's not necessarily part of society in the same way, I think, that it is in Prussia. Having said that, Prussia is also, on the other hand, an extremely liberal and tolerant state, and that's often forgotten. And this is something I wanted to raise, you know, with the book as well, is that you get religious tolerance to a degree that you hardly see anywhere else in Europe, you know, with the obviously starting with or you could argue basically is constantly in that state because it has got Protestant and Catholic elements within its realm and needs to deal with that. So, you know, you get Frederick the Great, obviously, even his father as well. There's huge religious tolerance there that leads to a flourishing of culture. You get this whole, you know, refugee movement from France with French Protestants, with the Huguenots fleeing and, you know, masses of them coming to Britain, and again, largely intellectuals and tradespeople and people like that bringing their own culture with them. So I think, you know, the fact that Prussia is also a very cultural, very intellectual, very philosophical state is often overlooked, but I don't think that necessarily takes away from the role that the military plays. The Prussian king, or all of the Prussian kings really themselves in the 19th century, are hugely concerned about that, about this element of like Landwehr units and militia element basically within the armed forces. At each point, it makes up something between 10 and 20%, I think, of the Prussian forces are always volunteer forces. And they're mega liberal, mega conscious of their Germanness, and they're loyal to what they see as the fatherland, i.e. some construct of Germany and not Prussia. And that's kind of something that they worry about. Bismarck actually says that Blood and Iron speech in the context of military reforms that the Prussian king is trying to push through parliament, where he wants to eradicate those volunteer units and completely restructure the Prussian military into a kind of professional force that is largely consistent of just professional soldiers rather than volunteers, because he's so concerned about their mindset and, you know, their loyalties that, you know, he doesn't see them as a professional armed force basically, but as something that might potentially be a problem if you get another 1848 type revolution. So I think it's a bit of both, and it seems a contrast, but or a kind of conflict between the two, but it's not necessarily one.
Okay, well, kind of on that theme, we've got a question from Robert Gowers, who asks, how much merit is there to the idea held by Konrad Adenauer that Germany could only become a truly democratic country if its Prussian influences or Prussianism were removed? And just to kind of slightly put a spin on that question, it's almost impossible, isn't it, to look at the history of 19th century Germany and Prussia specifically without an awareness of what happens with Nazi Germany. And do you think without that catastrophe, our sense of Prussia would be different? That we would kind of emphasize perhaps a bit more the way that, the incredible liberal strains within it, its incredible intellectual and cultural achievements, rather than the image of, spiked helmets and goose stepping and so on, which is what certainly in this country, and you must be more than very aware of this, is what tends to get emphasized.
Yeah, indeed. I think we're partially falling into the trap of listening to Nazi propaganda with that as well. I think. The way that Hitler directly, tried to put himself just, with the very word, the Third Reich, going there and sort of saying, oh, this is now the successor state to the Second Reich, which in turn is the successor state to the First. And quite famously, he had that portrait of Frederick the Great down in the bunker with him in the last days in Berlin in 1945 and all of that. So I think to some extent it's the Nazis' own propaganda that sought to draw a line there, basically a straight line from Prussia to the Nazis. You have the Day of Potsdam, of course, which Hitler again uses as a means of drawing continuity between Prussia and. So
what is that? I don't know about that.
So the Day of Potsdam was Hitler's way of getting Hindenburg's approval for his reign in public, and so they basically meet up in public, and Hindenburg's shaking Hitler's hands, and you have this kind of Prussian insignia everywhere. So rather than having the Nazi flags kind of plastered all over the place, they're using a lot of sort of iron crosses and sort of Prussian insignia really to try and draw a similarity there. And this is somewhat ironic given that Franz von Papen had actually practically abolished Prussia in the sort of so-called Prussian coup in 1932, where he literally integrated it using Article 48, literally integrated it into the German kind of federal system in a way that practically abolished it. So in many ways, people always talk about the abolishment of Prussia in 1947. In many ways, it got abolished in 1932, and yet Hitler is keen to. He doesn't restore that, so Hitler sticks with the centralized state, and doesn't allow Prussia any power back itself. But nonetheless likes the idea of, there was always militarism there, so we're a militaristic society, so let's stick with that. And I think that's stuck because of Hitler's brilliant propaganda in the sense of it, its effect on people. I think that's echoed through the ages, and we still have that now, I think.
But the military opposition to Hitler, that was kind of Prussian as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think both the loyalty and the this kind of misplaced sense of loyalty that Prussian officers felt due to their sense of obedience and duty and all of that. Basically, to them, their kind of ethos as a military is they're like the watchdog basically of the state. They don't get involved in politics. They do what they're told, and they do it well. And that's, I think, partially responsible for the devastation caused in the Second World War. And then on the flip side, you've also got, of course, huge Prussian opposition as per July Plot in 1944. So in many ways, you can see both elements there. I think a Prussian conscience and a Prussian sense of duty and obedience, both leading to, what we see in the Second World War.
I wanted to just follow up, Katja, on Tom's question. I agree, by the way, that with what Tom said, that it's impossible really to talk about German history without even if you try to banish it, that the spectre of Nazism is kind of hanging over you to some extent as a historian. But also I think the First World War too, because, the sort of the discussion about Germany being flawed from the outset and Germany being militaristic, that didn't begin in the Second World War. That was all there in British propaganda, particularly in the middle of the First World War, that the Germans were uniquely, rapacious or greedy and sort of enslaved by their generals and all this sort of stuff. And hanging over a lot of the questions from the listeners is basically Prussian and German responsibility for World War I. Now, we had a podcast that generated tons of discussion about the causes of World War I. And I'm wondering, in your book, you seem to go along with the idea that ultimately you think it's Germany's fault, or that Germany bears a huge share of the responsibility for the war, that it is the blank check, the Kaiser's ambitions, all this sort of stuff. Do you want to say a bit more about that? Do you think it was Germany's fault, the First World War?
Well, what I was trying to see it from a German perspective, and I think I wouldn't go as far as to say it is Germany's fault in the sense that they were deliberately causing a world war, but I do think they were taking the view that conflict was helpful for the internal divisions that were still there. So Bismarck had tried his best, obviously, for better or worse, with his various different policies to unite Germans, but it was blatantly obvious by the time that Wilhelm came into power that socially, culturally, religiously, Germans were still hugely divided, and that realm was constantly at risk of breaking apart. And I think when it became more obvious that conflict in some shape or form could be lived again, bearing in mind that there hadn't been a war since the Franco-Prussian War, and that was by that time, more than 4 decades away, they needed something. Otherwise, that realm was breaking apart. There was this, famous period that's often called, you can see it as stagnation, really, if you want to, but it was certainly almost a crisis from about 1912 to 1914. Whilst it didn't seem that way, there were no great uprisings or anything like that. But there was complete standstill in the Reichstag. The trade unions were swelling in ranks. There was some sort of sense that a crisis internally was about to erupt. And I think Wilhelm and the militaries accepted that they needed something to do to deal with that, and a war seemed a good idea in that sense. So, and bearing in mind as well that the First World War is on a scale that people just hadn't anticipated. They literally just thought they were going to have another, I think, sort of 1870 or maybe a bit bigger in the Balkans, and that would be the end of that. Wilhelm in particular was so deluded about the fact that Britain wouldn't get involved, surely not his family and all the rest of it, that I think, if you want to put the blame on them for that, yes, but I don't think they were willingly walking into a world war, with the possible exception actually of Moltke, maybe, because he had this thing about being Moltke the Younger and needing to step into the footsteps of his famous uncle Moltke the Elder, who'd kind of made his name in the Franco-Prussian War. So I think with him there is a bit more ambition there than with the rest. And
do you think we're too hard generally on the Kaiser, on Wilhelm II? Do you think he's basically a slightly pitiful comic figure, isn't he, rather than this sort of all-conquering spiked helmet kind of...
I'd go with that, yeah. That's not to absolve him from his responsibility and from his, from what he effectively did. The buck stops with him ultimately. He's not only the head of state, but also the, commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So he could have put his foot down, I suppose. But then when you look at just intellectually, I think he neither had the capability nor the patience to actually sit there and work it all out. So I think in many ways, I wouldn't say he was played by the militaries, but he was certainly not, I think, capable of seeing the bigger picture of this and just allowed himself to be, kind of intrigued, I guess, by the prospect of war and by being able to try all of his new shiny toys that he'd been developing in the last sort of 10, 20 years. I think that's a huge aspect, is childlike fascination for all things technological and military and things. Not only military, but he loved his technology as well. And to sit there with all of those new, dreadnought class ships and whatever, and he sits there and wonders, what will they actually do? What will it be like? And, that I wouldn't underestimate as a psychological factor, that he just wanted to see it live and in action.
And he wore the wrong yachting shoes to cows, didn't he? Which I'm sure had a devastating psychological effect on him.
This is something deeply rooted in your own subconscious, clearly, because this is the second time in these podcasts that you've mentioned the issue of yachting shoes.
I'll tell you what it is. I had a friend who's at school whose father was a captain to ship in the Falklands. And one of the perks is that you could get a yacht and sail around the Isle of Wight. And it was one of the worst 4 days of my life. I was constantly seasick. And I remember we pulled into the harbour at Cowes and I looked at people kind of walking up and down the quay. And I've never felt as jealous of anyone. And I've always felt some fellow feeling with the Kaiser who turned up and had a miserable time at Cowes ever since. But enough of me and the Kaiser. Katja, one person who I think we perhaps haven't talked about enough is Bismarck. And I wonder... How influential is Bismarck on this. We have a question from Pat Cooper, who says, if Bismarck had come 30 years earlier, would we have been talking about a global Prussian-German empire rather than a British empire? I mean, I guess that's kind of bundling into the idea of German ambitions overseas that perhaps we could also look at. But more generally, is Bismarck an illustration of the great man theory, or is he born on a kind of Hegelian tide of, the spirit of he's merely the spokesman for the spirit of the age, and it will all.
If you were talking about Hegelian tides at cows, Tom, I'm not surprised that you didn't fit in with the yachting fraternity.
Make sure you're wearing the right shoes for that one.
That's right. I was debagged.
I think if ever there was an example that theory, the great man theory, still has any validity, I think Bismarck must surely be it. I mean, it's hard to see how things would have panned out the same way without him. It's just the sheer audacity to do what he did, I think, when everybody else looked at it and went, no, that's not possible, you can't do it. Starting with that speech, with that Blood and Iron speech, when you look at Wilhelm had struggled with
so tell us about that. What for those who may not be familiar with it, among which is me.
So Bismarck was actually in France. He was the ambassador to France in 1861, and that there's a reason for that, because Wilhelm I, who would later become the German Kaiser, had only just become the King of Prussia, and was a bit frightened of this kind of quite outrageous, Prussian aristocrat who's very outspoken and very direct and didn't seem to have any respect for anyone, really. And so he sent him off first to St. Petersburg and then to France as the ambassador, so he'd be kind of safely tucked away, but he was good at diplomacy, so it kind of worked both ways. But he struggled with parliament internally, with the Prussian parliament, because he needed to reform the army, as I was saying, to get rid of those volunteer units who seemed quite dangerous. And parliament was obviously at that point, full of liberals. So they were sat there going, absolutely not, because these people are on our side and they're kind of our lever to get the king to do what we want the king to do. So that led to such desperation that Wilhelm was actually on the brink of abdicating, and thought at that point, I can't do this. I need to hand over to Frederick, what will later become Frederick III, much more liberal in this mindset, married to Queen Victoria's oldest daughter, Vicky. So that would have worked, because Parliament would have, got on with them and they would have kind of pulled in the same direction. And it's at that point, when you look at the influence that Bismarck has, he pulls them back from France. He comes back and just tells Parliament, well, no, we are reforming the military, whether you want to or not, and illegally goes ahead against the constitution, goes ahead and just does it. And Parliament just sit there and go, you can't do that, it's against the law. And he goes, well, try and stop me, what are you going to do? And just does it. It is in that context that he tells them with that Blood and Iron speech, I'm sorry, but it's not your speeches, not your niceties, not your legalities that people will respect about Prussia. It's force, it's blood and iron, we need to have this army. And so he just does it. He actually reigns without parliamentary approval for that budget until I think it's 1874, I think, when he finally actually goes back to Parliament after Germany had been created and says, oh, can you just approve my budget in hindsight, please, for all of those years that I reigned without it? And at that point, they haven't got a choice. They just go with it, and it's kind of made legal in hindsight afterwards. So there, for instance, the king is in despair. The king sits there and thinks he has to listen to Parliament. And it's Bismarck that comes back and goes, well, what are they going to do? Let's just not bother. And builds that army and fights those unification wars. And it's the same with the Franco-Prussian War. It's hard to see how anybody else would have had the audacity to provoke the French to the degree that he did, so that they would actually attack knowing full well they can't win the war. I mean, how do you provoke a country in attacking another country when that country is perfectly aware of the fact that they have 2/3, as they phrased it, of everything that Germany had? 1/3, sorry. They had this kind of weird idea that everything that the French have, the Germans have 2 things of, be that people, money, anything. So, those 2 things alone, I think, just show his individual actions and the consequences that they had, for better or worse, however you want to see that. But he's certainly an influential figure, and without him, I think the wars wouldn't have happened then and how they happened, and Germany wouldn't have been unified in 1871 with all the consequences that had.
Katja, we're running a bit out of time, I reckon. But I really wanted to ask, because it's a huge question, about Germany's relationship now with its past. When most ordinary Germans, I'm not talking about historians or intellectuals, but most ordinary Germans look at their own past or think about Germany, do they still do so with any sense of sort of trauma or guilt? Or do they now regard it as other European countries regard their own past as something that is, is gone, belongs to somebody else, and they don't need to sort of beat themselves up about it anymore?
What, specifically about Prussia, or just all of it?
Germany's history, defeated in 2 world wars, incredibly traumatically, revolution in 1919, the Weimar Republic, which we haven't really talked about at all, which is a fantastic, interesting subject, but obviously so difficult and conflicted. And then, of course, the experience of the Third Reich. I mean, that's so utterly different from how Britain thinks about the 20th century. I mean, that's the story of very contrasting relationships with Europe to some extent. And I'm wondering, do Germans now contemplate that story with equanimity rather than with sort of breastbeating and shame and all the rest of it?
Well, I think, in a recent article, I called the Second World War this black hole in German history that sucks everything into it that came before and after. And I think that's still very much the case. Everything seemingly before 1933 leads up to that, and everything after 1945 goes back to it. And I think that's still very much the case. When I was at school, I had to learn about the Nazis like 3 times. So we started at some point in year 8 and then revisited it at GCSE level and then again at A level. And at some point you're like, well, I know everything about that now. Can we do something else, please? So there is that sense that I think that it needs to be explained, needs to be explored, needs to be reminded of, or people need to be reminded of it. And I think, when you look at the fact that this year is the 150th anniversary of 1871, of effectively the beginning of the German state, there's I wouldn't have expected like celebrations or anything, but there isn't even sort of any, like you normally expect, say with the Russian Revolution, there was loads of museums and speeches and books and publications and whatnot. And there's very, very little in Germany. There's a little bit on the Franco-Prussian War specifically, but not on the fact that Germany was founded then, because people don't really know what to do with that legacy. The moment you commemorate it, you've got to interpret it in some way. And then, what you do, as you say, always lead back to both of those wars, and you end up once again discussing it in that light. And Bismarck is perhaps a good example of that. He's very, very difficult for a lot of Germans to deal with, because yes, on the one hand side, he created the welfare state and you've got all of those kind of achievements. But then people sit there and go, oh, but he only did it because of, the threat of socialism and all the rest of it. So there's always, even with Bismarck, there's a huge amount of ambiguity there, and people don't really know what to do with him. So he's just got ignored more and more, I find, in sort of, certainly in the 90s and early 2000s. It seems to be coming back a little bit now, again, the attention on Bismarck. But Wilhelm as well, you got 2 big Wilhelm biographers. One is Röhl, who's British. The other one is Christopher Clark, who's Australian.
Röhl hates Wilhelm, doesn't he? I mean, he absolutely hates him.
I find that a bit interesting with Clark as well, when both in this Prussia book and in the Wilhelm biography, he starts off not wanting to like both of them, I feel. And then kind of as he did his research and as he carried on writing about them, becomes a little bit more sympathetic towards them. But I find it interesting that no German historian wants to touch Wilhelm with a barge pole. That's, yes, there is a lot of Prussian history, but that always focuses on, Frederick the Great and those supposedly good Prussian days and years. And then it's again, let's go back to Prussian militarism and see how it led to the First World War and then the Second World War.
Well, Katja, I can't thank you enough. I mean, you said the Second World War is a kind of black hole in German history, but I think you've really done brilliantly in keeping us from falling too deeply into that black hole. It's been so interesting to talk, to try and look at Prussia kind of through the eyes of 19th century, I guess, rather than the mid 20th century. So can't thank you enough. Can't thank everyone. Thanks to everyone else for listening today. At the moment, we're releasing podcasts twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays, and I hope with subjects broad enough to appeal to most tastes. So, auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Thanks for listening to The Rest is History. For bonus episodes, early access, ad-free listening, and access to our chat community, please sign up at restishistorypod.com. That's restishistorypod.com.